Well, hello everyone. Welcome back. This is S.C. Coleman, author, and in this video we are going to be continuing to cover Department of Defense so-called activities and paperwork. With essentially what they're calling audit reports. They're not really audits. Most people believe that an audit is relative to the mafia, right? A fictional caricature of what the so-called mafia is. Al Capone, bank robbers, Bonnie and Clyde, that type of stuff. So that conceptual idea of an audit is based around finance and money. But usually the practical aspects of finance and money, as in actual numbers, in these so-called audits, there is in fact no number of anything given. Now, two of these are done by the Department of Defense Office of the Inspector General, so-called, which are attorneys. The first one, however, clearly is not written by somebody who is in any capacity an auditor, but rather, in fact, is indeed an attorney. And it's possible, if not probable, that these documents come from the same originating source, which will be, in some respect, attorneys, or made up of attorneys. They all talk the same, think the same, act the same. You know that saying, if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, and looks like a duck, then it's a duck, right? Now, the first thing that we need to understand with these documents is that you cannot trust anything actually being reported in these documents. As we all know, attorneys are liars, and this is no different. All of these documents are ripe with fraudulent information. So you can't actually trust any of the signatures, any of the dates, and any of the information given. You can't just trust it alone. You do, however, for the purpose of accurate analysis, it is required that a person comprehend the purposes behind this type of paperwork. Now, apart from the obvious context of attorneys and their purposes and the obvious treasonous activity involved here, something that we need to understand is the concept and idea of establishing legal sanctity. And that's the perspective that will be found in these documents. Legal sanctity is similar to the idea of sanctity of law enforcement. To sanctify something means it is above reproach. It cannot be criticized or questioned. Simply placing the moniker law enforcement is enough. It is sanctified. It's the same thing with religion. If it is called religion, it cannot be questioned, it cannot be debated, it cannot be analyzed or criticized. That is the idea of sanctification. So when you have legal sanctification, it is the idea that a documentation alone is paramount. If it is documented in a, quote, legal document, even though that's redundant, because legality of something is reduced to writing, it has to do with paperwork specifically and only. If something is legally sanctified, that perspective is present today in the obsessive and overly compulsive adherence to forms and files. Today, in just about every function of the so-called government, wherever it is, wherever you go, wherever you live, and whatever you do, you will always find the sanctity of legality. If you go into a doctor's office and you fill out a form, the secretary, administrator, whatever you want to call them, who works there, will get angry at you for one of two things. Either you filled out the form wrong, or you did not fill out a form. That perspective is this legal sanctity. It is the prevailing opinion today that a crime can be found simply in failing to fill out a form or not filling it out correctly. It has nothing to do with what is contained in the form. It has nothing to do with any types of actions outside of that. If you walk into a DMV or any so-called government office today, you run into that sanctity, legal sanctity, where they will try and they will feel fully empowered to, as it say goes, rip your head off or chew you out or whatever you want to call it, but scream and yell at you or act like completely vindictive and nasty just based off of forms alone. This is the incursion of a legal treason, meaning treason through paperwork, which has proliferated in large part by licensed attorneys working together in organizational collusive activities of treason. Treason being that they are acting treasonous as according to the U.S. constitutional definition of treason, of which, of course, they already revised that and everything else. Either way, the constitutional definition of treason fits. They are attempting to wage war through paperwork on the population, meaning the nation, and on the country, meaning the land. So we have to understand this concept of legal sanctity, because this appears everywhere. It is the idea that simply adherence to paperwork is all that's required, and when somebody says it's the law, in this context, you can't ask them which law, because there's many laws. So whenever somebody says it's the law, right, and it's the same thing here. Or when someone says it's illegal, meaning not reduced to writing. Well, there's a lot of things that can't be reduced to writing. And just the simple fact that it can't be reduced to writing is considered in and itself a crime. So with these attorneys, they, in most parts, have proliferated a collusive legal treason through documents like this. The United States Governmental Accountability Office, that's a cover identity. DoD bulk fuel improved management over transactions could lead to more reliable reporting. Reporting is the big issue here. They want to collect and obtain information in the same way any military intelligence outfit would want to collect information for specific operational purposes. Essentially the idea of espionage. The Defense Logistics Agency, and this is going to be our main character in this saga, is responsible for managing DoD's bulk fuel program, including procuring fuel on the open market, storing and transporting the fuel, and selling the fuel to DoD customers. DLA uses its money from its working capital fund to finance bulk fuel purchases and reimburses the fund when it receives payments from its customers. DLA's auditor reported a material weakness in internal control. Notice the use of the word there, material weakness. That is an attorney jargon word. In internal control over financial reporting related to DLA's inventory processes, including the agency's inability to support fuel inventory held in pipelines and fuel in transit. DLA developed a plan to address the material weakness. However, according to DLA, the plan could take until fiscal year 2025 to fully implement. That was, of course, last year. Both the DoD Office of Inspector General, OIG, and GOA, or GAO, have issued reports highlighting issues with DoD's bulk fuel program. Well, no surprise, because those are probably coming from the same originating source. Simply adding either the letterhead Office of Inspector General or the letterhead Government Accountability Office. Because this is the games, these are the games that these attorneys play, and they play off each other, and essentially are the paper hand behind the legal fiction and public theater that is so-called Congress, that is in fact not a real Congress at all. Since 1995, GAO has designated DoD financial management as high risk because of pervasive weaknesses in its financial management system, business processes, internal controls, and financial reporting. Now, this is part of a idea that was put forth in an Department of Education document, where their purpose was to redefine the military as a corporation, with the ultimate step of transitioning the military from the nominal hands of the people and into the practical and nominal hands of, quote, the law, therefore making a global law enforcement, occupational security, public service entity, and to completely do away with any use of this word military, thus ensuring that all so-called security force assets will be under the control of attorneys globally. For our objectives, 89% of DoD's total fuel purchase, the departments of the Air Force, Army, and Navy, and the U.S. Transportation Command, U.S. Transcom, were interviewed. This is important for a little bit later on. We also interviewed officials from the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense, OUSD, and here it lists it as Comptroller. That so-called Office of the Undersecretary of Defense is an aberration from the United Nations and attorneys overseas in Europe, basically, to insinuate their types of concepts and ideas into the United States structure, operational structure. And it did not exist in the past, even though they've backdated it. And it is essentially the idea of an undersecretary comes from the United Nations specifically. Defense Finance and Accounting Service, DFAS, now I'm familiar with that. DLA, I'm also familiar with that. And Selected Components. I can't say whether or not I'm familiar with those because they're not listed. It's just vague selected components. In 2004, the Secretary of Defense designated DLA as the executive agent for bulk petroleum. Boy, that lines up pretty perfectly with the invasion of Iraq, which was in fact about oil and not WMD, so-called, apparently. This authority granted DLA the responsibility to execute supply chain management for all DoD bulk fuel. Oh, surprise, surprise. In order to improve efficiency and minimize duplication and redundancy within the supply chain. For anybody who has any type of military or force experience, they will understand the idea behind minimizing redundancy as a motive implemented by enemy combatants. You actually want to have redundancy. It makes things more secure. And a good example of this would be if you store all your files, all your files, on your phone or your cell phone, and then you lose that cell phone, the physical copies of those files are gone. If your cell phone did not connect to the internet, which most of them do nowadays, then they would be gone. There would be no way to recover them. I guess a better example would be if you stored everything on a flash drive, and just that flash drive alone. And then you lost that flash drive, it's all gone. No way to get it back. You would have to track that thing down, and if you can't find it, then you're out of luck. That's the idea of redundancy. Instead of storing it on one flash drive, you also store it on your computer, and you store it on your phone, and you store it in the cloud, and you store it all over the place. And that way, if you lose one or the other, you won't have lost all of it, right? If your computer gets hacked, and conversely, if your computer gets hacked and you've stored your documents on the flash drive, which this has already happened to me, then it's no biggie, because all the stuff that they tried to hack and destroy, you still retain because you plan for it and have redundancy. And so if somebody wants to minimize redundancy, they want to ensure that there is a single point of exploitation. DLA Energy is responsible for managing DoD's bulk fuel program, including procuring fuel, storing and transporting it, and selling it to DoD customers. Customers include the military services and foreign governments. DLA Energy stores bulk fuel at Defense Support Points, DFSP, which are real property assets owned by contractors. DFSPs are located on military installations at contractor facilities. Isn't that nice? DoD has issued guidance for managing energy commodities, including bulk fuel, natural gas, coal, and electricity, to support peacetime and wartime missions and to permit successful and efficient deployment and deployment of forces. That's, of course, their cover story. In fact, they are desiring to sabotage and weaken the combative capabilities of the United States, for which their treasonous overthrow will be complete. Its overarching policy on managing energy commodities establishes policy for minimizing fuel inventory levels. Yeah, that's something I said they were doing before, which is moving the practical control over fuel resources and reserves somewhere else. Who knows where? China, maybe? Europe? I don't know. And I'm not saying that China specifically is an enemy, because China is just another in this United Nations game of fictitious corporate business governments, which are, of course, just fictitious little pawns of internationalist cabal of paper-pushing attorneys. Financial statements provide information such as assets and liabilities, and also provide financial results such as revenues and expenses. Now, like I said before, this document is very clearly written from the perspective of an attorney and not an accountant. Components regularly send summarized fuel transaction information to DFAS, the DoD agency that provides accounting support for DoD. And here it lists something called business fuel end-to-end business process documentation, and millstrip process details, and procure to pay millstrip. Now, of course, when I hear the word millstrip, I'm thinking stripping the military, which is the idea, of course, of removing something from someone. Stripping someone of their rank means you're taking their rank, but in that context, it's usually proverbial. Often you don't actually go up and rip their rank off. They do that in some ceremonies or whatnot. But here the idea of mill strip is to strip the military of capabilities, of resources, of everything that they need, so that they become essentially neutralized as a effective combative force, so that our enemies can easily take over the United States, which of course is the main reason why they want to, gun control, because they want to strip the United States of all defensive capabilities, including those of, quote, private gun ownership. Even though private gun ownership actually applies, and the reason why they want private gun ownership is because they want all guns to be owned privately by them. Meaning the military will be privately owned by them. Of course, they're going to call it law enforcement. And those are the only people who will have, quote, private gun ownership, will be them. And all those guns and weapons and materials will simply be leased out to those that will be intended for using them. The documentation does not align with the requisition process, requisitions, of course, meaning acquisitions, which means the taking of something, that we observed during our walkthroughs at Fort Bliss and Fort Hood. Now, the interesting part here is that this is the only section in which they stipulate our walkthroughs. And it's only the Army, right? Those are Army bases. And then these are dated June 30th of 2022. Now, Marine Corps was not originally listed. And this stipulates military standard requisition and issue procedures, which is the breakdown of MILSTRIP, what they would call an acronym. But really, it's just a joke. It's in coded language. Now, probably the reason why they did not reference the Marine Corps is because you've that commonly heard phrase, the Marine Corps is a department of the Navy, which is extremely aggravating for different reasons. The Marine Corps, as part of their plan to restructure, redefine the military as a corporation, as a business corporation type entity, was to place the Marine Corps, which in itself, corps is like corporation, under the so-called Department of the Navy. It's not under the Navy, it's under the Department of the Navy. And the Department of the Navy is going to have one of their appointed secretaries of the Navy. That was not an old structure for the Navy. And in the old structure, the constitutional structure, the Marine Corps were, as it says, soldier sailors. Meaning first they start in the Army and then they get placed with the Navy. And that's how you enter the Marine Corps in the past. I wouldn't change anything right now if it was possible. If I just, as they say, have that brush, which is funny, that they always like to reference writing and power, the pen is mightier than the sword and all that type of stuff. If I could just change that, then I'm not sure I would. As far as the concept that Marines have that we're run by the Navy. I mean, the Marine Corps is in pretty much all respects actually separate from the Navy, practically speaking. But there is a symbiotic relationship between the Marine Corps and the Navy at this point that's developed because, and possibly an unintended consequence, of the attempted restructuring from the past, where there would have been a more symbiotic relationship with the Marine Corps and the Army in the past, because Marines came from the Army. So the Royal Marines of Britain, so-called Redcoats, which marched on Trenton and Concord and Lexington, they would have been soldiers. They would have been soldiers in the British Army, or the United Kingdom Army, the Army, whatever they called it at that time. Because these names are new. They're not the same names they used in the past. And mostly in that period of time, they spoke French. So they would probably refer to themselves some form of French. But either way, they were Army, and the constitutional or continental militaries of the colonies would have been structured in a similar fashion. Because everybody structured it like that. The French structured it like that. The North Africans, the North Africans had a slightly different structure than that. Either way, to continue, we have something called a swim lane process flow map for fuel exchange agreements. Then you have U.S. Transportation Command, U.S. Transcom, Military Sea Lift Command, Quality Management System Procedures Manual. That sounds like a whole bunch of civilian attorney garbage. Secretary of Defense is required by law. They love that. The Secretary of Defense is required by law to develop and maintain a blueprint to guide the development of integrated business processes within the department. If that doesn't sound like some snot-nosed, creepo attorney, then that's really what all of this sounds like. Actually, the older ones are a little bit less snot-nosed or snotty than this type of wording. Now here's a question from this particular page, which is, who is management? Because the way in which they're talking about management here, it sounds like some hidden overarching entity over there. Does not sound like the way they would want you to think of management, which is just the concept of management in general. But rather it sounds like some actual structural entity which is managing these things. Federal internal control standards require management to design control activities to achieve objectives and respond to risks. Now that's going to be repeated about, I think, 4 times throughout this document. Specifically, management defines responsibilities, assigns them key roles, and delegates authority to achieve the entity's objectives. Notice when it says, and delegates authority to achieve the entity's objectives. So management is an entity. In addition, management implements control activities through policies. Specifically, management documents and policies for each unit is responsible for an operational processes, objectives, and related risks and control activity, design, implementation, and operating effectiveness. Each unit also documents policies in the appropriate level of detail to allow management to effectively monitor the control activity. In DLA's Fuel Manager Defense System, FMD, so that's listed there, the DLA Fuel Manager Defense. See, it's such a weird name, right? DLA's Fuels Manager Defense System. That sounds like a system for the defense of the fuels manager. That does not sound like it's a managing system for the defense or for fuel that's intended for defense. That's not how it's written. It's written as though it's a system for the defense of the manager of fuels. The military services use DLA's FMD system to record and reconcile the quantity of fuel purchased from DLA. Well, that's nice, they're purchasing it from DLA. Federal internal controls standards state that segregation of duties helps prevent fraud, waste, and abuse in an internal control system. So it does not help prevent fraud, waste, and abuse in an external control system. That's interesting. Now, the idea here, what they're talking about, brings up a phrase, divide et impera, which means divide and conquer. As previously stated, federal internal control standards require management to design control activities to achieve objectives and respond to risks. Number 2. And now we get to number 3. In reviewing DLA's Fund 15 fuel data budget exhibits prepared for fiscal years 2019 through 2021 for petroleum and aerospace fuel, they contain the data input for procured from DLA Energy, but not the columns for procured by service and stabilized price. That's a weird column title. Procured by service, so they want to know which service, and stabilized price. What is a stabilized price? As previously stated, federal internal control standards require management to design control activities to achieve objectives and respond to risks. Number 3. The OUSD comptroller officials did not provide a reason why the guidance did not explain key attributes of the template, not establishing clear guidance over the information to be reported in the fuel budget reconciliation exhibits increases the risk that management and policymakers, as I said, will not have reliable information about how DoD is using the resources it is provided. Interesting. We found that 1, the military services and DLA did not follow DoD-wide policy on the use of real property assets. The military services did not review and validate fuel purchases, and the military services and U.S. Transcom lack a process that facilitates tracing transactions recorded in the financial accounting system through supporting documentation generated at the time fuel is purchased. So obviously none of this has anything to do with the actual facts and figures, the numbers, etc. None of this has anything to do with actual accounting at all. and here it references the GOA and the DoD OIG, or Department of Defense Office of Inspector General, which I guarantee are the same. They're just different letterheads. DLA established a corrective action plan to address findings that financial statement auditors identified relating to DLA's inability to provide documentation supporting the balances of fuel inventory held in pipelines and fuel in transit. However, we found the following. None of this is going to surprise anyone. DLA and the military services did not establish a memorandum of agreement to delineate the rights and responsibilities of parties in the use of the military services, DFSPs, to store and manage DLA-owned bulk fuel. Like I said, nothing to do with the actual numbers or accounting at all. DLA does not have a plan to establish MOAs with the military installations and that are storing DLA-owned fuel in the DFSPs. So really it's just all about the memorandums. Did you read the memo? That type of phrase, right? You hear that a lot from bosses. I put it in the memo. Did you read the memo? You know? A USD comptroller ultimately left it to DLA and the military services to establish their own individual MOAs. Now this can get confusing. According to DLA officials, DLA approached the Navy and the Marine Corps to establish a similar template, but neither responded. Despite not having an MOA template, DLA worked with the Navy and the Marine Corps to establish 4 MOAs with different military installations storing DLA-owned fuel. So what does that mean? It's really convoluted. How did they manage to do that, but no response was given? That doesn't make any sense. So, of course, you have to make it make sense, which, of course, means that they just did it anyway, as they often do, because they are, in fact, enemy combatants. And they don't care one way or another. They just have to get what they need to get done, and that's that. They would like the cover or presence of legitimacy and so-called cooperation, but if they don't get it, then they're just going to go ahead and do it anyway, regardless, because they have to get it done, and they will do it in your face if necessary, because, as always, they don't expect anyone to ever do anything about this, and to just let them blatantly, in most cases, commit treason, mayhem, and all the constitutional idea of warfare, espionage, and just general bad behavior. U.S. Transcom used DD Form 1149 requisition and invoice/shipping document, or DD Form 898 energy sales slip. Interesting numbers for a year, 1898 and 1149. I don't know about 1149, but I know 1898 was a particularly auspicious year. I'm being sarcastic. And here's number 4. In addition, federal internal control standards require management to design control activities to achieve the entity's objectives and respond to risks. Number 4. Air Force and Marine Corps officials took over 3 months to trace 3 fuel transactions from their financial accounting systems to supporting documentation and provide the information we requested. An Army official stated that Army officials traced fuel purchases from the Army's accounting systems to supporting documentation by using their judgment and combination of attributes available in the accounting system, such as the DoD Activity Address Code, Agency Program Code, and the date range of the transaction. A Navy official stated, a U.S. Transcom official stated, however, down here at the bottom it says, according to Marine Corps officials. So I wonder what the change in singular to plural is all about. Now, the military services record fuel transactions in their own financial accounting systems after their purchases are initially recorded in DLA's FMD system. This is what is commonly referred to today as double entry accounting. The idea that accounts are made in 2 separate places. That is not the actual double entry accounting. That is simply the way it is referred to today. Most quote-unquote accounting professionals know that idea as double entry accounting, which comes directly from attorneys. The real double entry accounting is the idea of recording purchases in 2 different forms of monies, meaning either gold and silver, copper and silver, or gold and copper. That is the true form of double entry accounting. It's very difficult to do today. It would be the idea that you record the value of something in both US dollars and fuel. That would be weird, right? If it's a very large quantity and you look at something and say, this is equivalent to, I'm going to be way off here, but $2.8 million, and in the equivalency to fuel, it would equal, I don't know what that would be, maybe 20 tons? I have no idea. Or a couple tons of fuel, right? That would be double entry accounting. The fuel is a form of exchange. They can't have the original double entry accounting used in practice by anybody, because that means, by and large, people would have a much better understanding of so-called purchasing power and the fact that US dollars are simply a medium of exchange, and there's many other forms of a medium of exchange. So they take the original double entry accounting used by accountants, which means recording in two different modalities of money, and they change it to only recording in two separate books. That's not double entry accounting, though. That is accounting in two books, so you could call it two-book accounting, but it's not two entries or double entry in the same book. That's the difference in the wording. They try to say it means you're entering it in two different books, double entry, but the term double entry actually means entering it twice in the same book. Big difference. Accurate financial reporting in the federal government helps ensure accountability to the public and that decision makers have reliable information about how DoD is using its resources. In order to accurately present financial information in its financial statements, management designs and implements accounting policies, procedures, and controls to help ensure that all events affecting transactions are captured and accurately recorded. Again, that management sounds like some type of hidden hand, puppet master type entity out there. Management, of course, is not we the people as the Constitution intended. It is critical that DoD addresses the recording, reporting, and reconciling issues identified so that accountability and internal controls are established and maintained. Whether DLA or U.S. Transcom has responsibility for DoD's bulk fuel, the issues identified in this report need to be addressed to ensure that DoD clearly establishes roles and responsibilities under the new bulk fuel management and oversight structure, and it maintains proper accountability for fuel operations. That sounds exactly like some snot-nosed, political appointed manager at whatever company you want to talk about, either McDonald's or Target or Walmart or whatever. That's exactly what the tone in those two paragraphs is. They are talking down to the so-called DoD and other affiliate entities as though they were employees, or as though they were basic level employees. You could just easily hear that person saying, "Did you read my memo?" While DoD has issued guidance for recording and reporting fuel purchases, the guidance is insufficient, and in some instances inconsistent with department-wide and government-wide guidance. Oh, that's nice. Not having fully documented the end-to-end fuel business process with clearly defined roles and responsibilities and processes to review and validate the accuracy of fuel purchases increases the risk that entities will not appropriately design and implement control activities that help ensure accountability over DoD's bulk fuel and effectively manage and control costs. Until corrected, these deficiencies increase the risk that fuel inventory and purchase and sale information are inaccurately recorded and reported in DoD's financial statements, which they don't really care about. Further, inconsistently performing or not performing the reconciliations increases the risk of DoD management and Congress. Right, DoD management and Congress. So Congress is not the management of DoD. Who is the management of DoD? I think the obvious answer is their attorneys. They're a bunch of United Nations attorneys leveraging their little treasonous mechanism to force a coup and acquisition or takeover of our fighting capabilities so that they can impose their, quote, law enforcement. Further, inconsistently performing or not performing the reconciliations increases the risk of, oh yeah, I already said that. Congress, of course, is non-existent. We don't have Congress. Not having reliable information about how DoD is using resources it is provided. The Secretary of Defense should ensure that the roles and responsibilities of the organizations and personnel that manage and oversee DoD fuel program at defense fuel support points are clearly defined and documented. What a surprise. The Secretary of Defense should develop a plan for implementing memorandums of agreement that delineate the rights and responsibilities of each party responsible for DoD fuel functions at all DoD sites where military service owned real property assets are used to store bulk fuel. And of course, they write all of the documents signed by the fictitious Secretary of Defense, who's a civilian, as usual. We provide a draft for this report to DoD for review and comment. DoD concurred with all 21 of our recommendations and stated that we'll ensure that recommendations are addressed. What a surprise! In fact, that concurrence by the so-called DoD probably originated from the same people that wrote this. If you or your staff have any questions about this report, please contact me at 202-512-2989 or KOCIOLEKK@gao.gov. Yeah, that's not a real point of contact by any means. And here's the lovely little fake name that you get. Is a Miss Kristen Kosiolek. And the signature line of Kristen Kosiolek is written, well, no, that looks like it's written Kristen, but it's got no date. Lists as Director, Financial Management and Assurance. And it looks like it was written in a permanent marker and then photocopied. That's kind of interesting. Now, the so-called response from the Department of Defense stating that this report was dated April 26, 2023, is a Mr. Sylvester Copeland, but it was digitally signed by a Thomas Charles Steffens on June 2nd, 2023, and he's listed as the Deputy Chief Financial Officer. So one has to wonder just how real those names actually are, and if they are in fact real people at all. Because a lot of this stuff could be generated by computer programs, which were, of course, implemented by real people. Now, taking a step back in time, at least as far as the dating of this document goes, we have May 14th, 2002, Supply Inventory Management, Evaluation of Defense Supply Center Columbus, Qualified Products List and Qualified Manufacturers List Program. Now, a couple things to note. This is listed the Department of Defense Office of the Inspector General, Quality, Integrity, Accountability. Some ideas given here is that, for any that have seen the movie El Dorado, Tulio and the other guy, I don't remember his name, play fight each other when they get found out for fraud. So they're playing with loaded dice in the movie, and it's an animated children's movie. And when they get found out that they play with loaded dice, they both blame each other, and then they start fighting each other, but it's all pretend. That's the idea here. These attorneys pretend fight each other, and their actual purpose is to work together, but present the appearance that they're in fact competing against each other. Now, the overall process here explained is the idea of sabotage by breakage and the creation of a single point of fault. So not only are you making a single point equilibrium, if you will, a single point of exploitation, but you're also making it weak enough that it's easy to break. So that's the idea of sabotage by breakage and the creation of a fault, such as a fault line. So one of the things they do when they play their little game of we're enemies, but they're really not, is they always like to give each other special authorities and responsibilities and privileges. They always like to tell each other, you're responsible for this. Well, you're responsible for this. And so thus they acquire all these responsibilities because they tell each other that they're responsible for things and they're authorized to do stuff, which they're really not. They just, accuse each other of it. And so thus they become empowered for whatever that stupid accusation is. They pretend to be at odds, of course. Now, both sides, in all respects, have a major design towards autonomization, making everything automatically done according to their parameters. Not simply automated, but automated according to what they want. There are always attorneys hiding undercover, or you can call them addies if you want. And they seek to build an easily breakable system of conduct. A system of conduct that is easy to break. So this is May 14th, 2002. Memorandum for Director, Defense Logistics Agency, DoD Directive 7650.3 requires that all recommendations be resolved promptly as a result of management comments. Here again, we are talking about management as some type of puppet master entity over there that rules over all of this corporate structure. We request that the Defense Logistics Agency provide additional comments on recommendations. We request that management provide comments by July 15th, 2002. Deputy Assistant Inspector General for Auditing, Thomas F. Gimbel. Oh, worse, Thomas F. Gimbel, Acting Deputy Assistant Inspector General for Auditing. Whatever the hell that title is. Jeez. Evaluation. The purpose here is the acquisition of control. The Defense Supply Center Columbus Qualified Product List / Qualified Manufactured List program was started in 1962 when qualifying activity responsibility for about 75 qualified products list was transitioned from so-called military departments. They weren't really military departments, they were the military. The military was departmentalized. And then all this stuff was transitioned, quote, over to the control of the Defense Logistics Agency. Because the Defense Supply Center management directed the sourcing and qualifications unit to shift engineers to the being produced from engineers to the commodity management group and base reutilization and closure, the workforce has been reduced from approximately 90 staff years in FY 1989 to 50 staff years in FY 2000. In the same time period, the qualified product list and qualified manufacturing list managed increased from 164 to over 300. So the thing that they're talking about, the base reutilization and closure, is a cover for the transition of military assets, quote unquote, to the hands of private interests, civilian, quote, law enforcement type of deal, that sort of thing, as I've covered in previous videos. Results, certification and retention policy for its qualified manufacturers was not fully enforced. The sourcing and qualifications unit could not trace sources and authenticity of their products because they did not receive 6,479 certificates of conformance and traceability. As a result, manufacturers without the proper qualification remained in the qualified products list and qualified manufacturers list program. So they impose this, quote, legal nonsense, the legal sanctity idea. They impose paperwork. And then because that paperwork's not fulfilled, then they say it's a problem, which of course is a problem that they created. And it has nothing to do with anything other than filling out forms. Summary of recommendations. Either recertify the manufacturer or remove it from the qualified product lists or Qualified Manufacturer List program. That's called a licensure, and it is a particular evil that we are all dealing with in our everyday lives. Provide product quality deficiency reports and certificates of conformance and traceability documentation to the Qualified Products List managers. Accomplish the certification. Yes, of course, that's what they really care about, is the paperwork and the paperwork alone, and the conformance to that paperwork. Director, Defense Logistics Agency, partially concurred with the finding and recommendations. The director did not concur that they did not have an effective program and stated that the program effectiveness should have been based on avoiding procurement delays. They partially concurred with either recertifying or removing the manufacturers from the list and stated the policy does not have such a provision. So, of course, yeah, this is like Tulio and the other guy in El Dorado. They're playing off each other. They're pretending to be at odds, but in fact are, like I said, pretending so that they can both achieve the same ends while no one's the wiser. The Defense Logistics Agency does not have the authority to remove manufacturers from the Qualified Product List and Qualified Manufacturers List when it is necessary to protect the government and the user's interests. So otherwise, it does quote-unquote have authority, because that's what they're insinuating here. And then, of course, they can just write a piece of paper that gives them the authority to do whatever else they want to do, and it will probably be made in the same fashion as this nonsense. Qualified Product Lists, QPL, and Qualified Manufacturer Lists, QML program. The QPL and QML program aims to increase product quality, reliability, and buying productivity, and enhance logistics management operations by establishing a list of products that have met qualifications requirements stated in the applicable specification. This is, of course, about reducing everything to writing and control of that being reduced to writing. The manufacturer maintains adequate processes and quality control procedures and conducts specified testing to ensure that items continually comply with all specification requirements. So that's reducing liability to the manufacturer. In addition, the manufacturer maintains trend analysis and reports of deficiency disclosed during testing and ensures that delivered items conform to all requirements. So if they don't, then it's the fault of the manufacturer, and if you say have a problem with that, then you have to go directly to the manufacturer, which I'm sure will be impossible to find because they're going to be listed behind layers of subcontracted and contracting entities and whatnot. User ensures that the qualified reporting any nonconformances to the qualifying activity. So like I said, if you have a problem with it, take it up with the manufacturer, not the people that are supposed to be responsible for the manufacturers, and that's what they're saying here. That's nice. Like I said, sabotage through breakage. The QA is also required to take appropriate action on any reported nonconformance and quality or reliability problems associated with QPL and QML products. What is the QA? Usually QA means question and answer, but here again it sounds like they're talking about a particular entity completely separate with the name QA. So weird the way they do this crap. I mean, who thinks like this? Only attorneys think like this, pretty much. But where do they get it, right? Where does that perspective get trained into them? From where does it originate? It's so strange. QA, of course, here they're saying is a qualifying activity. But how can a qualifying activity take appropriate action? Right? Pretty weird. Okay, so DSC Columbus actively procures about 168,000 national stock numbers, NSNs. These qualified NSNs include monolithic microcircuits, hybrid microcircuits, aircraft hydraulic hoses, vacuum and de-icing system components, resistors, capacitors, filters, circuit breakers, switches, connectors, relays, fiber optic conductors and cables, semiconductor devices, antennas, waveguides, and electrical boards. All of which, if you design to fail, can cause some pretty significant damage to the operational capabilities of what's supposed to be, anyway, our military. But is, in fact, according to them, their military, their property. DSC Columbus primary management of the QPLs and QMLs is the responsibility of the Sourcing Qualifications Unit, which is comprised of 4 teams that contribute to the maintenance of its QPLs and QMLs. And if that doesn't sound like some type of cell spy team, then then obviously none of this is what it appears to be. And it's all, or all of this is what it appears to be technically, and it's all hunky-dory and above board, and I'm just a lunatic, which is what they would say anyway, mentally unstable or disturbed or some other, have a mental health crisis, right? Those are all the little stupid words they use to attack somebody who is in obvious opposition to their treasonous plans. Custom devices team, electronic devices team, hybrid devices team, and passive devices team. Yep, those definitely sound like they are enemy espionage cells. All specifications and corresponding QPLs and QMLs are maintained in the DoD acquisition, streamlining and standardization information system, or ASSIST. That's not how acronyms work. Acronyms are supposed to give you the ability to speak quickly. You put an acronym, as it's used in the military, simply to memorize a phrase or to communicate something in a rapid fashion. They're using acronyms as a joke. They're using it for wink wink nudge nudge crap, you know what I mean? A mill strip, assist. That's not the purpose of an acronym. And they also use it, of course, for playing these little word games where they state the name, they define it, and then they put it into an acronym, and then the next paragraph is just full of acronyms where they say reference, QRSL to the FLDN, and they do all that nonsense. So they also use it for that purpose to try to make your head spin. So here we have the implementation of a chatbot, or the automated system, which we all know very well at this point. They're so helpful. The Plans and Policy Division serves as the focal point for receiving complaints in the form of product quality deficiency reports. So, fill out form crap. Providing entry to the customer depot complaint system, and distributing complaints to an appropriate quality assurance specialist. And that's going to be outsourced to like India or something like that, right? The usual. DSC Columbus has in the past worked conscientiously to promote the use of the QPL and QML program by the services and federal and civilian agencies. So here's the plan. Effectiveness of management of the Qualified Products List and Qualified Manufacturers List program. DSC Columbus did not have an effective Qualified Product List and Qualified Manufacturers List program, did not fully enforce certification and retention policy for its qualified manufacturers. So like I said, they create the problem, which isn't really a problem, and then they solve the problem, which inevitably is going to lead to more control and more problems, which they can then have solved so that they can have more control and create more problems. And that doesn't matter. Here's the reduced carbon footprint and drive automation nonsense. DSC Columbus Sourcing and Qualifications Unit Personnel and Workload. A review of the QA staffing demonstrated that a significant reduction in personnel had occurred since 1989, mind you. Moreover, during the same period, their QPL and QML workload had increased significantly. The Sourcing and Qualifications Unit staff stated that the lack of staffing is the cause for outdated certifications. Yep. Create problem, impose solution. Not create problem, offer solution. It's always create problem and impose solution. And like I said before, generally their problems are created, which aren't really problems, and then they're solved in a way that causes more problems and leads to more control and more treason and more automation, which is a big one. The COCT documentation attempts to reduce the risk of unauthorized substitutes and fraud from dealers and distributors. If that is the only thing that you have to, quote, reduce risk of unauthorized substitutes and fraud, then that's going to be the reason for a lot of it. I mean, if you're dependent only on paperwork then you create the situation, well, in this regard, you create the situation for fraud and unauthorized substitutes, pretty much. Here we've got Government Quality Assurance Representative, or CAR, QAR. A defense contractor management agency, CAR inspector, provides inspection at the source. Nice. So great. Now, here's the attorney, the way that the addies or attorneys communicate undercover. DLA suggested that we change recertification to certification, since certification is the terminology used in DoD 4120.24-M. They also suggested that we change preparing activity to qualifying activity, since the qualifying activity is responsible for reviewing and certifying each QPL and QML manufacturer on a periodic basis. This reminds me of a thing I read previously from the University of Nebraska-Kearney, in which the primary concern that someone had was that in the paperwork it did not use enough the term whereas at the beginning of paragraphs. I mean, what a bunch of insignificant nonsense, right? But that's pretty much what they're doing here. And that is a way in which attorneys communicate to other attorneys that they are licensed attorneys. Sort of like a code word or a safe word, right? Well, maybe I don't use the idea of the safe word because of the context, but a code word is something someone would use between partners to identify them to those partners that they are in fact who they say they are and have not been replaced by someone or otherwise been compromised. And that's the idea here. Among attorneys, they use certain phrases and certain insignificant requests or issues, or, as in this case, they're talking about the redefining or the different use of words and whatnot. And that's a way that attorneys communicate under the radar to each other, stating, I am a licensed attorney, basically. Recommendations, management comments, and evaluation response. We recommend that the Commander Defense Supply Center Columbus, Defense Logistics Agency, provide product quality deficiency reports information to the qualified products list managers at the Defense Supply Center Columbus, the Defense Logistics Agency. The DSC Columbus Policy and Plans Division, DSCC BDT, began sending a list of opened and closed PQDRs on QPL and QML items with its associated NSNs grouped by federal stock classes to the QA in November 2001. And like I said, that is another ridiculous thing that they do with acronyms, which has nothing to do with the actual purpose of acronyms, and they just reduce it down to a whole bunch of gobbledygook. Provide certificate of conformance and traceability information, blah, 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 that's espionage. Perform a review of resources required to accomplish the recertification and provide adequate resources to accomplish the mission. So that's going to involve a whole bunch of different things. Management comments. DLA concurred with its recommendations, stating that due to resource constraints and DoD imposed resource limits, DSC Columbus had to adjust their resources. They proposed to review engineering resources, review recruitment actions to fulfill critical engineering activities or vacancies, and increase automation to improve efficiency and effectiveness. So, like I said before, the idea to automate it for their own purposes, and also, of course, to collect information that is necessary for the implementation of their treason. The General Accounting Office, there they are again, has identified several high-risk areas in DoD. Imagine my surprise. This evaluation provides coverage of the DoD inventory management high-risk area. So that's like their use of the term at-risk population, meaning that population is at risk of disintegration or destruction by them, basically. August 2028, 1996, required DoD organizations to implement a comprehensive system of management controls that provides reasonable assurance that programs are operating as intended and to evaluate the adequacy of the controls. And most of this stuff is all intended for use by foreign enemies in Europe or attorneys from the United Nations. And the United Nations is in itself a cover entity or cover identity. So report distribution, we have the Department of the Army, Auditor General, that's going to be an attorney. Naval Inspector General, Auditor General, also going to be an attorney. Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, Financial Management and Comptroller, Auditor General, that's going to be another attorney. Then we have the Director of Defense Logistics Agency and Commander of the Defense Supply Center Columbus, who is probably a civilian, and the Office of Management and Budget. Now here we've got something stipulating the House Committee on Government Reform and then just the Committee on Government Reform. It's kind of weird. It is also listed here 4 times. Committee on Government Reform, Committee on Government Reform, and Committee on Government Reform. Why would they repeat Committee on Government Reform 4 times? Not even in a paragraph. Pretty much consecutively, one after the other, on the list for congressional committees and subcommittees, chairman and ranking minority member. And as you can see there, I have them highlighted. That's odd. Now this is dated March 14, 2002, Memorandum for Assistant Inspector General for Auditing, Department of Defense. The Defense Logistics Agency partially concurs with all recommendations. Surprise, surprise. Defense Supply Center Columbus, and proposes to take corrective measures as stated in Attachment 1. And that's also not really a surprise. General comments to the draft report's conclusion concerning the effective implementations of the Department of Defense Qualified Products List, QPL, and Qualified Manufacturers List, QML programs. The DoD QPL/QML program is important to the fulfillment of DLA's mission. No surprise there. The program helps increase the assurance that the warfighters receive quality parts. Bad quality parts, more like. We appreciate the opportunity to comment on the draft report. Questions may be referred to Mr. William Lee, Technical and Quality Policy Division, or Ms. Annelle Williams, Internal Review Office. Hawthorne L. Proctor, Major General, USA, Director, Logistics Operations. Yeah, right. And it's just a bunch of garbage. Under evaluation team members, we have the Audit Follow-up and Technical Support Directorate, Office of the Assistant Inspector General for Auditing of the Department of Defense. What kind of crap is that? David A. Brinkman, nice name. Kenneth H. Stavengord, that's with a J. So Stavengord, what weird name. Jaime A. Bobbio, or Jamie A. Bobbio. Chandra P. Sonklaw, and Wei K. Cheng. Interesting name. This last document is an audit report from the Office of Inspector General, Department of Defense. Its purpose is clearly to establish legal precedent, as are all of these, where they can be cited in other documents, giving themselves fraudulent authority. And as usual, is coming from the perspective of fake opposition, false outrage, and the public theater event of a staged fight, right? Outsourcing of Defense Supply Center Columbus bus and taxi service operation, April 13th, 1999. Report number 99-132, Office of the Inspector General, Department of Defense. Memorandum for Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Technology, Director, Defense Logistics Center, or Defense Logistics Agency, Commander, Defense Supply Center, Columbus. Audit report on outsourcing of Defense Supply Center Columbus bus and taxi service operations. The audit was conducted in response to allegations made to the Defense Hotline. Of course, there weren't any real allegations at all. The Defense Logistics Agency comments conform to the requirements of DoD Directive 7650.3. Therefore, additional comments are not required. Signed, Deputy Assistant Inspector General for Auditing, David K. Steensma. So stupid. Introduction. We performed the audit in response to allegations to the Defense Hotline and the Defense Supply Center. Columbus outsourcing study for bus and taxi service operations was based on incorrect methodology. Yeah, right. We did not review the Defense Supply Center Columbus Management Control Program because of the limited scope of the complaint. Naturally, because they wrote the complaint and there was no real complaint. Installation services officials did not comply with legal and policy requirements for outsourcing commercial activities and created unnecessary disruption and distrust within the motor pool. And of course, here in this document, they're going to define what the, quote, installation service or the legal and policy requirements for outsourcing commercial activities actually are. We recommend that the Director of Defense Logistics Agency publish a policy statement on obtaining installation services support in Defense Supply Center Columbus and other field activities that delineates organizational responsibilities for performing cost comparison procedures and establishes processes to be followed for commercial activities using Office of Management and Budget Circular A76 waiver or exception authority. So of course, yeah, they're taking a problem that never existed and that they invented and leveraging it to delineate responsibilities and roles. All that other sort of conquest type nonsense. The Defense Logistics Agency agreed to publish a policy statement on obtaining installation services support that delineates organizational responsibilities for performing cost comparison procedures and establishes processes to be followed for commercial activities using the Office of Management and Budget Circular A76. What a surprise, because they're probably all being written by possibly even the same person. Wouldn't that be rather ironic? So correct methodology is the issue, apparently. And it's not just about the lowest bidder, but it's also about so much more. So there's no real complaint. And the specific objective for this audit report was to determine the merit of the allegations to the Defense Hotline. There were no allegations and there is no Defense Hotline. We did not review the DSCC Management Control Program because of the limited scope of the complaint. So they repeated that one again for some reason. On May 29, 1998, the chief of the DSCC Installation Operations and Program Division sent an email to the Deputy Director and other senior managers that stated, "We have made the final decision to contract the bus and taxi service here in base. To that end, we have a proposal for all services from Laid Law." What a weird name. "We want to send you for contract action." Woody has the information. The contractor would have his own dispatcher to serve as customer interface. Your part, as I see it, would be to develop and contract and manage the QC, quality control, to some extent. So that's obviously going to be fake. There is something strange with this name, Laid Law, which is apparently a bus contractor. It doesn't make any sense. Why would they be called Laid Law? It's a law that's been laid. Requesting Laid Law to provide a proposal for providing bus and taxi services. Laid Law was chosen because of a standing contract with Central Ohio Transit Authority for the Columbus, Ohio area. What a surprise. Not really. DSCC officials wanted the study and any contract award accomplished in less than 12 months. Of course. The DSCC bus movement study was performed by DSCC personnel who did not consult a contracting officer prior to soliciting formal proposals from Laid Law. DSCC personnel did not inform the employees that Laid Law would receive a contract for bus and taxi service operations. The DSCC base supporting contract personnel were not aware of the Laidlaw contract proposals, or that the Office of Installation Services was conducting an outsourced study of the functions. That's nice. On June 8, 1998, the Deputy Director of the Office of Installation Services and the Chief of the Installation Operations and Program Division met with motor pool employees. The employees stated that the DSCC officials informed them that it was a done deal to contract out the bus and taxi service operations to Laidlaw. Here they're creating their backstory. As a result of the meeting, 12 civilian employees assigned to the motor pool signed a memorandum dated June 10th, 1998. Oh, geez, here we go again with this stupid memorandum. To the DoD hotline and Congressman John Kasich, yeah, right, alleging that the DSCC officials plan to contract out bus and taxi service operations based on incorrect methodology. And that's, of course, the biggest problem here is that it's incorrect methodology. Yeah, right. What a bunch of garbage. And I think the rest of this is just more gobbledygook that really isn't necessary to cover. I mean, I went through this whole thing and highlighted stuff that I thought was important or whatnot. But for the purposes of brevity, I'll just cover the areas in which I had notes attached to them. And you got a bunch of paperwork with signatures, their evidence, if you will. But it's pretty much all highly probable that it's all just fake, right? It's highly probable it's all fake. That's the idea of verifying fraud with more fraud, is that you create a pattern or history which is hard to refute. But when you go through it and pick through all of it and analyze all of it, in fact, all of the documents will associate together as fraudulent based off of different analytical parameters, such as signatures, dates, names, people who aren't real. They're all like that. That creates a pattern and history of fraud, and it shows that the documents are, in fact, corroborating each other through a fraudulent purpose. And that helps to corroborate the fact that they're actually fraud. So that's sort of an interesting game being played. Most of the time people see a layered of files of documents and they assume that that's corroborative enough to ensure that those documents are perceived as legitimate. So anyway, stay tuned for the next one. It will be equally interesting, hopefully even more so.